It is time. Oh, yeah. I may lose my voice in the middle of this very brief introduction. So I realize people are streaming in like the nations prior to the great white throne judgment. So if you felt the buzz in the room from the corner behind you to your right, the professorate is excited because this is the first time this particular lecture has been given as part of the Christian Mind course. And so the anticipation is high, and justifiably so. The speaker is Professor Weichbrodt. She's an assistant professor of art history. I suppose I should be technically correct about that. She did her undergraduate degree here, and her master's and PhD in art history and archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis. Before I have her come up, next week's lecture is the last lecture in here of the course. There's another meeting on the Tuesday after break in here, but it's not really a lecture. No. Wait, the news is worse than that, and I'm giving the lecture next Tuesday. The reading for that lecture, the reading for that lecture is to watch the movie Chariots of Fire. The fact that it will take you longer to watch the movie than to read anything else that's been assigned this semester apparently makes no difference. There will be a showing of the movie next Monday night in Mills 160, the basement of Mills, at 7 o'clock, if you haven't seen it or just want to see it again. But that's next Monday night at 7 o'clock. I think it's on the calendar in the syllabus. And now I will turn it over to Professor Weichbrodt.
Good afternoon. So usually when I tell people that I'm an art historian, I get a lot of blank looks. You might be thinking that I should be a kind of crusty, bespectacled professor that's really dusty and looking at old things, or maybe you think that I can tell you how much that sculpture in your grandma's house is actually worth, something like that. It's easy for us to think that art history is something that's very distant from our contemporary lived experience. What people have been keeping from you is the fact that being an art historian is kind of like having a superpower. Let me explain. So, say Professor Morton's favorite band comes out with a new album, and you're wondering about that cover art. Well, guess what? Art history has got you covered. Or maybe you just got an issue of Sports Illustrated magazine in the mail, and that cover is really weird. It's really weird. Never fear, art history is here for you. Obviously, the editors are simply connecting Tom Brady to the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, and who made a claim to divinity, and they're using what we as art historians call hieratic scale. Or you're standing outside the movie theater and you're trying to decide whether or not Dunkirk is going to be just another one of those movies where you have to kind of grapple with this big greatness that's so much more, unfathomable to you. And then once you do that, you're going to be able to overcome and move forward. And the answer is yes, it is. All of these are admittedly silly, but awesome examples. My point is that art history, the study of how images acquire and communicate meaning, can actually have something to say about more familiar images that we see today. So what I want to do in this lecture is explore how a single photograph, one that many of you have maybe seen before, can actually affect the way that we treat other people. In particular, I want to argue that this image plays a powerful but often unrecognized role in how we understand the structure and direction of two very important categories of identity, race and gender. First, the image. I want you to think about what you see. Don't think about what you know about the image. Really, really look at it. What do we see? I see bodies pressed together in a tightly cropped black and white photograph. There are 2 rows of figures that stretch across the middle ground, and they're striding towards the viewer. In the back row, you can just make out 2 helmeted soldiers and a few men in light straw hats. The front row consists entirely of young women with neat hair, crisp dresses, and narrowed eyes. But what's the focus of the image? It's that woman in the foreground, right? She's walking alone. She too is wearing an immaculate shirt dress, clutching a book tightly to her chest. We can't really see her expression. She's wearing sunglasses. But the clear separation from the rest of the people in the photograph encourages us to recognize her visible difference. She's the only black figure in a sea of white. Just behind her left shoulder, a white girl squints her eyes and opens her mouth in this snarling, ferocious yell. This is a photograph of Elizabeth Eckford walking toward Little Rock High School while Hazel Bryan screams over her shoulder. Eckford was one of the Little Rock Nine, a group of young, high-performing students chosen by the NAACP to integrate the previously all-white school. On September 4th, 1957, the day that this photograph was made, the governor of Arkansas deployed National Guard troops to the school in order to uphold segregation. Elizabeth Eckford does not make it into the building that day. Have you seen this photograph before? Oh, see, good. Probably in like the civil rights or desegregation section of your American history textbook, or a PBS special on race in America, something like that. This is the kind of photograph that we tend to perceive not as an artwork, but as a document, right? It's an objective witness to historical events. We might even think that this image needs no interpretation. Its meaning seems evident on the surface. There's no symbolism for us to decode. There's no brushstrokes that remind us that an artist actually made it. We might also be inclined to declare this image an unambiguous success. As the story goes, the photographer captures this uncensored moment of raw racial hatred. White, moral viewers respond with appropriate outrage, and voila, we have the eventual desegregation of public schools. And yet, historical photographs like this don't just live in the past. They play an active role today, shaping both our cultural memory, so how we understand the past, but also our attitudes towards other people. Now, this image does have a feel-good story. The photograph was published the following morning in the Arkansas Gazette and was quickly picked up by many other national newspapers. It stoked an outcry over how Eckford and other black students were treated by white students and parents, as well as by the National Guard. And this photograph actually plays a big role in why President Eisenhower is forced to intervene in the situation. So within a couple of years of its making, it functions as a kind of shorthand for a fight well fought over school integration. Again, as the story goes, when faced with photographic proof of racism, kind-hearted white viewers rallied to support the cause of desegregation. Some of you might know that the school integration was a much more complex, fraught process. But the photograph maintains a particular kind of power because it asserts objectivity, it asserts truthfulness. Since the mid-19th century, photographs have been easily and cheaply disseminated. You can make lots of copies of a photograph, right? When you're looking at an oil painting, you're always reminded that somebody made it. When you're looking at a marble sculpture, you always know that somebody made it. When you look at a photograph, it's a lot easier to forget that somebody made it, that a photograph is still a made thing. Part of this is what the cultural critic Pierre Bourdieu calls the reality effect. By their nature, photographs are an index. They are an imprint. Analog photography is literally light writing. There's a physical relationship between what's in front of the lens and then what ends up on the negative. And so we have great faith in photography's truthfulness. Even now, even in the age of digital photography, we still claim that a photograph is worth 1,000 words. But here's the thing. This photograph and others like it also conceal things from us as viewers. Oh, we were doing so well with the clicker. Can you just go forward one for me? Okay. So there's, first of all, a visual eraser. A photograph as a still image only represents a split second, right? A fragment of a much longer series of events. It tells us nothing of the decades-long struggle of Black parents who were demanding better education for their children, or the repeated patient legal challenges that were leveled by the NAACP. The photograph doesn't show us that Eckford was actually accidentally separated from the rest of the other Black students and then turned away at the door by National Guardsmen. It doesn't show us that Hazel Bryan, a 15-year-old who's sort of desperate for attention, has almost really just wandered to the front lines just because she wanted to be the focus of something, not out of particular political conviction. And it certainly doesn't show us the white families, the relatively few, who actually welcomed the Supreme Court's injunction. Johnny Jenkins, the photographer of this image, chose to crop it rather tightly, literally cutting out a greater sense of context. But this is made especially clear, there we go. This is made especially clear when we compare it to another photograph from that day. This image, taken by Will Counts, offers a wider view of that same antagonistic procession. So in Counts' photograph, do you see how the crowd feels a little bit more diffuse? The contrast between Eckford and everybody else isn't as strong. She isn't as threatened, and so it's harder for us to find like one bad guy to kind of pin all of our discomfort onto. But the photograph also conceals things by being reproduced so many times. It has become what we call an icon. We see it simultaneously as a historical document and also as a transcendent artwork. It represents something more than just the moment in time. So in the case of this image of Eckford, the photograph's ubiquity, the fact that you've seen it a lot, contributes to its status as an icon or symbol. So like we said, you've seen it in textbooks, you've seen it in museum displays. If you were to do a Google image search for school desegregation, it's on the front page. And it's there because it functions as a symbol for America's supposed triumph. This is what we overcame, it declares. The photograph isn't really about Elizabeth Eckford or Hazel Bryan. They are stand-ins for their races, their genders, their social classes, and a historical moment. Art history teaches us to be wary of treating the photograph as an icon. The scholar Martin Berger reminds us that the image of Eckford and Bryan made it very, very easily for millions of white viewers to imagine that race was just a relational problem. The photograph allowed viewers to disregard the rootedness of white supremacy in laws, practices, and institutions. Those things are a lot harder to address than just one racist white schoolgirl, right? You can educate one person, you can ignore her if you need to. Systems are a lot harder to work with. Plus, the seemingly straightforward, certain nature of the photograph might suggest to us that its work is complete, that the struggle for racial justice, like the struggle for school integration, is a thing of the past. Okay, so everything that I've just said about how this photograph works, how it does a thing in the world, these are all insights from my discipline, art history. Art history has taught me how to interrogate an image and how to ask really hard questions about my own reaction to it. It's also taught me that images continue to work, that they assert and that they naturalize certain expectations about race, class, and gender, and that these are assumptions that may continue to guide my attitude towards relationships with image bearers today. So to use some of the vocabulary that you've been learning in this course, What I'm arguing is that art history has taught me that photographs do not simply reveal structure, they shape direction. Okay? Photographs do not simply reveal structure, they shape direction. Before we dig in to how exactly this photograph might reinforce a bent view of image bearing, I want to say a few words about race, gender, and the created order. The Bible clearly states in Genesis 1:27 that God created both man and woman in his own image. He creates male and female, and he institutes an order that, for whatever miraculous, unfathomable reason, best reflects the fullness of his nature. The Bible does not go on to then describe the first woman, Eve, as a demure, tender, emotional nurturer who loves the color pink. And it doesn't describe Adam as a bold, strong, and certain leader who really likes football. But too often throughout history, we have treated cultural notions of femininity and masculinity as if they are structure. And we have turned a blind eye to how these social structures have relegated women to the margins, denying their equal and inherent value with men. That was easy. Okay, how about race? When the Bible talks about race, it speaks of only one race, the human race. Everyone in the human race is an image bearer, and everyone is fallen. At the same time, the Bible does not set forward a monoculture as an ideal. As you learned from Professor Stevens a couple of weeks ago, human diversity is an inevitable consequence of obedience to the cultural mandate, right? The Bible does have a lot to say about what we call ethnicity. Ethnicity describes a population group whose members identify with each other on the basis of shared cultural traditions or experiences. In his beautiful description of heaven in Revelation 7, John sees every nation, tribe, people, and language bowing down before the Lamb. There's a diversity of people groups who have maintained their distinctiveness even as they join together in shared adoration of the Lord. Now don't worry, I'm going to explain more about the historical notion of race in just a minute. What I want us to recognize for now is that God's created order endows men and women of all people groups with equal dignity as image bearers, and God delights in the praise of a multi-ethnic people in the world to come. And now, an extended footnote. I do think that it's important to acknowledge that our very own tradition has been guilty of grossly misunderstanding the created structure. And as a result, we have perpetuated beliefs and practices that have denied the dignity and inherent value of image bearers. In fact, some of the people on our stained glass windows held to beliefs about gender and race that were deeply reflective of the damaging hierarchies of their own time. So Augustine, who's in that window over there, he believed that women bore God's image only when she was joined to a man as her head, although men bore God's image independently. Luther and Calvin, in their commentaries on Genesis, do see women as divine image bearers. And this was still a contested, fairly radical idea in their day. But they both still understand a woman to be inferior to men, that a woman's image bearing is more like the moon than it is the sun. So they bear God's image in a lesser, or what they call a secondary, nature. Jonathan Edwards, over on that window, was a slave owner. George Whitefield, right next to him, justified the purchase of slaves in order to support his orphanage work in Bethesda, Georgia. Although Whitefield in particular preached to blacks bound in slavery and declared that many of them would be brought home effectually to God, both evangelists believed, like most Anglo-Europeans in the 18th century, that black subservience to whites was just part of the created order. But guys, here is the really amazing thing. The efficacy of the Bible doesn't hinge on whether or not Augustine or Calvin or Edwards got everything right. Our Almighty God chooses to do his work through broken vessels. And that should be of incredible relief to you. That should give you an incredible sense of freedom, that God's effectual calling is still effectual, no matter how much we screw it up. And the Holy Spirit is still active. So Augustine, Luther, and Calvin, they each had women in their lives whom they loved and respected, and even ascribed spiritual growth as a result of relationships with these women. And Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, they actually served communion to African American slaves. God, in his grace, allowed these people at times to move in the direction of shalom, even as they perpetuated ungodly structures. That's mind-blowing. And you know what else is mind-blowing? Think about this. One of the most beautiful ways that I know that the gospel is true is that George Whitefield preaches to people who are held in chattel slavery. He preaches to people and he owns their kin. And you know what? They believe the gospel. That is how powerful the gospel is, that the word of God is as sharp as a double-edged sword, and it can slice through scientific racism, it can slice through all of these social hierarchies, and it can say, no, this isn't the gospel just for white men. This is the gospel for you, and this is freedom. This is salvation for you. That is the God that we serve, and that is incredible. I'm going to have a drink of water. Back to images. Text certainly played a significant role in shaping these men's ideas about women and blacks. Images were also at work. Images of women as temptresses or as desirable objects proliferated during the time of Augustine and Luther and Calvin, and images of blacks as lazy or bestial were very common during the time of Edwards and Whitefield. As I've been trying to argue, images make cultural norms seem natural. So the thought process goes, if women weren't naturally dangerous in their sexuality, then why would there be so many paintings and sculptures that depict them as such? Or all of these images of blacks as happily subservient clearly demonstrate that subservience is in their nature, right? But that's not how images work. How do images work? And how might they be similarly influencing us now? Well, as viewers, you are all carrying around a filing cabinet, a mental archive of images. You might not be able to name all of them, but you're always interpreting and categorizing images in relationship to things you've already seen. We can think about it like a filing cabinet. Maybe a more up-to-date kind of metaphor would be a Google image search. So if I put something like sunset into a Google image search, you get a lot of these, right? Glowing, highly saturated photographs, all of them vaguely familiar, all of them kind of reinforcing the idea of what a photo-worthy sunset looks like. This is how you know when you're supposed to take your phone out and take a picture at the back of the Great Hall, right? It's because you have these images in your brain already. The Google image search analogy extends to other examples with perhaps more at stake. So a search for wedding, for example, brings up images of wedding bands and bouquets, but also a lot of photographs of smiling, young, white, heterosexual couples that are all very thin and very fit, have very white smiles. Our visual archives are particularly powerful when it comes to identifying and policing bodies. The historian Alan Sekula observes that the photographic archive contains traces of the bodies of heroes, leaders, moral exemplars, celebrities, and those of the poor, the diseased, the insane, the criminal, the non-white, the female, and all other embodiments of the unworthy. That is, photographs teach us what heroism, morality, and fame should look like, and they do that primarily through contrast. So you look at these images and you're like, this is what is respectable, that is what is not. Every photograph that we see including this image of Eckford and Bryan, is understood in relationship to the archive of photographs that we have already seen. Furthermore, this famous photograph is already in your archive, right? You've already seen it before. So that means that you have been interpreting new images that you see, whether on social media or on a news website or in a book that you read for class. You've been interpreting all those new images in relationship to how you understand this one. So that's how the archive works in general. But now let's think specifically about how this photograph might be shaping our understanding of race and gender. So there's been a lot of scholarship on how photography has been used not only to shape racial bias, but to actually construct the very notion of race. Earlier, I talked about ethnicity as a social grouping that emerges along lines of shared practice. Race, on the other hand, is the historical classification of humans into groups based on physical traits that have been deemed socially significant. So if you think about it, we don't really divide people into racial categories based off of their eye color. There has not been a consensus that eye color is socially significant. Instead, we've chosen to focus on things like skin color, facial features, hair texture, things like that. Race divides people along particular lines of visible difference, creating artificial divisions that seem natural, and they also keep certain people in power and economically dominant. 19th century anthropologists and naturalists used photography to create a set of visual tropes that codified race. So by emphasizing certain physical characteristics, by posing bodies in particular ways, and framing the images with text, photographers were able to offer, quote-unquote, proof of racial difference, and importantly, of racial hierarchy, that this race is superior to another. In the photograph from Little Rock, Eckford's attire, posture, and demeanor present a picture of a young American girl. She embodies what is deserving, what is respectable. Indeed, in his coverage of that day, the journalist Bob Considine describes her as aristocratic. Wearing a crisp, neatly ironed dress and pressed hair, Eckford mirrors the poised, fresh-faced models in a Sears catalog. But remember, the archive also works through contrast. So what categories does Eckford resist? Well, she is neither the hypersexualized exotic object of desire, nor is she the desexualized, unattractive mammy, the two stereotypes most often granted to Black women. So she's safe. She's non-threatening to dominant culture's proclivities or social mores. The photograph's more subtle argument, constructed through the archive, is that Eckford can be assimilated into good, white society without too much fuss or uncomfortable adjustment on the part of dominant culture. But Eckford's body also contributes to another category of Blackness, that of the noble Black body in pain. The subject has a long history in photography, embodied very clearly in this 1863 abolitionist photograph of a former slave, now known only as Gordon. So here we see the scarred Black body damaged by brutal Southern whites put on display to galvanize the support of Northern white liberals. Art historian Martin Berger argues that the same visual formula of inactive Black bodies and active white bodies dominates the most well-known and frequently reproduced images of the civil rights movement. And indeed, it was this body, the body that doesn't fight back, but bears pain with a kind of noble, silent dignity, that Martin Luther King Jr. and others in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference found to be particularly effective in their nonviolent direct actions against segregation. And it was this stoic, seemingly passive body that other activist groups, such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and later the Black Panthers, largely rejected. Instead, they chose to represent potent, self-fashioning agency. And this made dominant white culture very, very uncomfortable. Meanwhile, it's our tendency to disassociate from the screaming young woman in the background. Regardless of your ethnicity, I bet you do not want to be categorized with Hazel Bryan. The sun illuminates her face from the side, outlining her ferociously gaping mouth. Her eyes pinched together, she's glaring at Eckford's back, and she strides forward forcefully. Unlike Eckford, Bryan is not upholding notions of middle-class respectability. Instead of smiling primly like a Sears catalog model, she is releasing this torrent of emotion in a very, very public space. And in doing so, she visually aligns herself with photographs like these, commissioned by the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot in the late 19th century. Charcot's photographs of women under his care at the Salpêtrière Mental Hospital construct a visual language of insanity manifested through hyper-emotionalism. Now, I'm not saying that you should look at the photograph from Little Rock and try to diagnose Hazel Bryan with a psychiatric disorder. But what I am saying is that mentally, how we categorize this image is that she goes into the same place as the images of the insane. She is other. She is someone who is outside of polite society. Bryan's expression functionally denies her social class and her gender. She is not acting as a lady ought to. In fact, she is acting as a villain ought to. And guess what? White viewers of this photograph in 1957 were also quick to disavow Bryan. An article in the Fresno Bee described her as having her mouth open in hate like a dog's, and a letter to the Milwaukee Journal called her a disgrace to the female sex. Even segregationists distanced themselves from Bryan, and she was soon forced to transfer high schools. She had disregarded the unspoken conventions of middle-class whiteness, and in doing so, her actual race is called into question. She was publicly classified as white trash, a label that signified not only a low economic status, but low moral status as well. Journalists covering the story called Bryan and others agitating against desegregation scrawny, red-necked men, slattern housewives, and harpies. Their descriptions echo the unflattering photographs of poor white sharecroppers taken in the 1930s by Margaret Burke White. The images in Burke White's book were captioned by her collaborator, Erskine Caldwell, but in the first person. So you get the sense that the people in the photographs are actually speaking these things to you, even though the sentiments are made up. In this one, a woman with cracked lips and uneven teeth squints and grimaces at the sun. It's throwing all of her wrinkles into high relief. Snuff is an almighty help when your teeth ache, Caldwell has her say, and so he's signifying her moral bankruptcy with her physical deterioration. By 1959, Bryan's reputation was cemented by a national news article that said that the ugly faces of rednecks, crackers, Tar Heels, and other poor white trash would be the ones remembered from Little Rock. Declaring Hazel Bryan and the other white protesters of the Little Rock Central High School to be white trash allowed the majority of white American public of the 1950s to remove themselves from any real responsibility in the increasingly violent struggle for Black civil rights. Racism could be explained as a personal problem, perpetuated by morally flawed individuals. The more uncomfortable work of examining the racial biases of social structures could be downplayed or even ignored. Now, with historical distance, some of you might very well recognize the shortcomings of such an attitude. But Johnny Jenkins' photograph of a noble, stoic Elizabeth Eckford and a screaming, animalistic Hazel Bryan continue to affect us. An apparently simple documentary photograph can establish certain ideals of race and gender as unequivocal and natural. It declares itself to be a direct imprint of structure, when in fact the fall is twisting our ability to see. It teaches us that certain Black bodies deserve our concern and our respect, and certain white bodies deserve our derision. It teaches us that there's a certain way to be a woman in public, And if you disregard those rules, you're going to be punished. And it does all of this very, very quietly, but very, very powerfully. As Christians called to recognize the dignity of God's image in all people, we have to do actual work to acknowledge how our own archives may have hampered or distorted our love for our neighbors. Okay, so how do we look more faithfully? Well, first, I think we need to look more. If our archive is part of what allows us to interpret these images, we should be building a bigger archive, a wider archive. We should be looking at photographs that disrupt or that complicate our understanding of historical events or race as a historical construct. So, for example, in 1956, 1 year before the desegregation in Little Rock, the Black photographer Gordon Parks went to Mobile, Alabama, on assignment for Life magazine. And while he was there, he was shooting images of one family, the Thornton family, this multi-generational group, and he did it in color rather than in black and white. In this image, which was published in his photo essay, we face a glass storefront window that's plastered with advertisements for banana splits, ice cream sandwiches, butter pecan ice cream. On the left-hand side of the photograph, we have a black man supporting a young girl as she tiptoes to drink from a water fountain. There are 3 other little girls, similarly dressed in pastel frocks, presumably waiting their turn to drink from the fountain. On the right third of the photograph, we see 2 more young black women wearing matching black sleeveless shirts, full printed skirts, and these really awesome big oversized pearl earrings. There's a second water fountain, though, right? And that second water fountain bisects the composition almost perfectly in half, a column of strangely empty negative space. And across the front of that fountain, we read, "White only." We might find this image to be unexpectedly poignant and upsetting. Color images create a greater sense of immediacy, whereas we can kind of hold black and white images a little bit at a distance and say, well, that's something that happened a long time ago. This image, like the rest that Parks took while on that assignment, focuses on the sort of mundane experiences of the Thornton family. They sit on the front porch, they go to theater, they chop wood, they play outside. The boycotts, the protests, the brutal acts of retaliation that are occurring at the same time in Alabama don't show up in Parks' photographs. But I think that in this prosaic moment at the water fountain, we have something that speaks very powerfully to the constant, insistent ordering of life along racial lines. Park presents the Thorntons not as victims of white violence, but as active agents who are choosing how they are going to negotiate a Jim Crow world. Parks's images can help us follow what the historian Lawrence Levine calls for in his essay, The Historian and the Icon. Writing about documentary photography in the 1930s, Levine reminds us that we must not forget that photographic subjects actually have lives outside of the photographic frame. That sounds like something that shouldn't be hard for us to remember, but it really is. Their stories exist prior to and after the moment of the iconic photograph. So Parks's images offer what might be new material for our visual archive, and they encourage a more robust imagination of lives lived outside the iconic image. Second, we should thoughtfully examine how contemporary news photographs, like their predecessors, continue to shape and reshape our expectations of socially appropriate expressions of race and gender. So take, for example, these 2 fairly recent photographs of black women. On the left, we have a photograph of Aisha Evans, taken last summer in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, during the protests that followed the fatal police shooting of Alton Sterling. The view of the protest is empty, kind of eerily so. Evans stands in profile, just to the right of the center of the image. She's alone in the middle of the road. She wears this really beautiful patterned summer dress that flutters around her perfectly still, straight body. And then you have these 2 bulky figures clad in black armor and wearing black helmets with these big visors rushing towards Evans from the left of the composition. In contrast with Evan's poise, the police officers are caught mid-movement, kind of scrambling to a halt. Again, the image raises a host of references. In fact, one commentator observes that this reminded him of a scene from Star Wars, a kind of standoff between a Jedi and faceless stormtroopers. I think that's true. But Evans is also the stoic, patient body so familiar from civil rights photography, right? She's a passive figure that's in need of help. She is in many ways another Elizabeth Eckford, embodying a particular notion of what acceptable womanhood and blackness might look like, and she's doing that in opposition to an anonymous and thus easily vilified show of force. Well, what about the image on the right? There we see a woman with muscular arms and a clenched hand yelling into a megaphone. Her mouth is open, the tendons on her neck pop into definition from the force of her yell. Her hair is shaved on the sides, and the middle springs up in a tightly curled mohawk. There are several white figures behind her. Some are watching, while others seem to be involved in a totally different conversation. Unlike Aisha Evans, this figure, this woman, is active. She screams. She's taking up space. Her arms are extended. She has exaggerated hair. She has a loud voice. She is not Elizabeth Eckford. She does not align with standards of appropriate femininity or decorum. She is instead the angry black woman, the sapphire of Plantation Yore, who is masculine, aggressive, and talked back to her master. This image might make us really uncomfortable. We might think that the woman should be more peaceful, or more persuasive, or more thoughtful, or more contained, or like, shouldn't you at least think more about your audience? But I want us to consider that part of our discomfort might be bound up in very complicated ways with the fact that she is disregarding the visual categories of appropriate blackness and womanhood that we have accepted as natural. Have we declared something to be structure when in fact we are grappling with the results of the fall? It does not necessarily take a vast knowledge of art history and visual culture to begin to look more faithfully, though taking an art history class certainly won't hurt you and can fulfill your fine arts distribution. When looking at historical or contemporary news photographs, we should simply but self-consciously ask ourselves, what's my initial response to this image? Who am I aligning myself with? Who am I critical of? Rather than merely accepting those responses as natural or normal, or thinking, wow, the photographer did a really good job, we can wonder why we feel that way. Perhaps we can answer the question with specific history or set of images. Perhaps you will be able to say, oh, this reminds me of that Disney villain that I saw once. Most often, you might not be able to do that. But just the act of acknowledging that a single photograph is part of this larger, complex web of meaning, just acknowledging that can stymie the seductive notion that photographs tell us everything that we need to know. Bringing others into conversation about such images can help broaden our archives and encourage us to look carefully at images that we might be prone to ignoring. These are the conversations that can help offer a more concrete way of tackling issues that can feel elusive or abstract at times. So that means that you guys have to not just look at images in isolation, but you have to figure out ways that you can share the looking of images with others, right? And not assume that everybody is looking at exactly the same images as you. Maybe there's something that you can do where you are sharing images that rub you the wrong way. Share those with your friends and see what they think. Figure out why they rub you the wrong way together. And I want you to hear this. Christ, who is indeed preeminent, used the discipline of art history to effect my sanctification. Art history taught me to recognize that the images I saw were not simply reflections of how things are. They were actively shaping how I thought things should be. Art history has really humbled me. It has driven me back to Scripture, it's driven me back to my knees, And I have to beg God for joyful grace to acknowledge my limitations. Part of my pursuing faithfulness is asking every day for the capacity to actually see the imago Dei in the people and in the images of people that I look at. Because in order to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly, we must be able to see clearly, and we must be able to look with eyes of love. Thank you, guys.